For much
Please
of
help
recorded
us.
history,
We are
hunger shaped
starving
the
and
fate of
freezing.
civilizations. It dictated when wars began, when cities emptied, when populations migrated, and when governments collapsed. In Europe, starvation was not an exception, but a recurring condition. From the Middle Ages through the early modern period, famine returned again and again, triggered by cold springs, failed harvests, war, or disrupted trade. Even in years of relative peace, entire regions lived one bad season away from disaster. Grain stores ran dry, livestock were slaughtered prematurely, and desperate people consumed seed grain meant for the next planting, sealing future hunger into the soil itself. Winter was not merely cold. It was feared. Chronic malnutrition weakened bodies long before outright famine arrived. When food failed, there were no safety nets beyond charity or local custom. Survival depended on the fortunes of individual households, landlords, or merchants. If one family's crop failed, that family often failed with it. If a region lost access to grain routes, starvation followed swiftly. Throughout Europe's history, this pattern repeated so often that famine was accepted as a grim feature of life rather than a solvable problem. At the same time, across the grasslands of North America, a very different system operated in the same centuries when European societies endured cycles of scarcity. Many indigenous nations developed food systems that dramatically reduced the risk of starvation. These systems did not eliminate hardship. They did not remove danger or unpredictability from life. But they transformed scarcity from a catastrophic threat into a manageable challenge. European observers noticed this difference early, and it unsettled them. Explorers, missionaries, and traders traveling through the plains and river valleys of North America recorded scenes that conflicted with their assumptions. While colonial outposts rationed dwindling supplies, nearby indigenous communities were described as possessing stores of preserved food sufficient to last through long winters. These were not moments of abundance following a lucky season. They were the expected outcome of systems designed specifically to withstand scarcity. The journals speak of smokehouses heavy with dried meat, of rawhide bags packed with rendered fat, of storage pits concealed underground, insulated from cold and moisture. They describe communal distribution of food, not hoarded surplus. They note elders, children, and the injured receiving food first. These accounts are often written with surprise, even discomfort, because they challenge the European belief that agriculture and private property were the only paths to security. The question that haunted these observers was not whether indigenous peoples hunted skillfully. That much was obvious. The deeper question was how entire communities could rely so consistently on systems that Europeans assumed were primitive or unstable. The answer lies in the difference between surviving scarcity and designing against it. European food systems, particularly in the pre-industrial era, relied heavily on annual grain harvests. Grain was vulnerable. It depended on weather patterns, soil conditions, and uninterrupted storage. Once spoiled or consumed, it could not be replaced until the next harvest. Preservation methods existed, but they were limited. Bread molded, salted meat spoiled, storage pests destroyed grain. A single failure often cascaded into prolonged hunger. In contrast, many indigenous food systems emphasized flexibility, mobility, preservation, and communal coordination. Rather than anchoring survival to one harvest or one household, they distributed risk across time, space, and people. Among Plains nations such as the Lakota, Blackfoot, Cree, Cheyenne, Mandan, and Hidatsa, the bison formed the cornerstone of food security. But the animal alone was not the system. The system was the knowledge, planning, and social organization built around it. Bison were not hunted randomly. They were managed through landscapes shaped over generations. Hunting required cooperation at a scale Europeans rarely practiced outside of war. Dozens or hundreds of people coordinated movement, timing, and labor. Roles were assigned. Signals were standardized. Knowledge was transmitted carefully from elders to youth. The hunt began long before the animals arrived. Land management played a central role. Indigenous nations actively shaped the prairie using controlled fire. Seasonal burns cleared old growth, stimulated fresh grass, and created predictable grazing corridors. Bison, drawn instinctively to nutrient-rich forage, returned to these areas year after year. Hunters did not follow the herds blindly. They shaped where herds would go. This practice required deep ecological knowledge. Fires had to be set at the right time, under the right conditions, with an understanding of wind, soil, and regrowth patterns. The goal was not destruction, but renewal. Burned grasslands produced higher quality forage, which in turn supported larger, healthier herds. The land itself became a tool. Drive lanes were established across open terrain, subtly marked by stone cairns or shaped by natural features. These lanes guided animals toward specific locations: cliffs, ravines, river bends, or snow-choked passages, where the terrain itself assisted the hunters. Geography replaced fences. Gravity replaced weapons. Nowhere is this system more clearly preserved than at major bison jump sites, particularly Head Smash and Buffalo Jump in what is now southern Alberta. This site contains nearly 6,000 years of accumulated evidence. Layers of bison bone, more than 12 meters deep, stacked generation upon generation at the base of a limestone cliff. These remains are not the result of random kills. They record deliberate, repeated, large-scale communal hunts. Archaeologists can distinguish individual events within the layers, reading cut marks, bone placement, and tool debris like chapters in a book. Some layers reflect massive kills involving hundreds of animals in a single drive. Others suggest smaller hunts, perhaps during leaner years or with fewer participants. Each hunt followed a similar pattern. Hunters approached carefully, often disguised to avoid alarming the herd. Runners positioned themselves strategically, sometimes crawling, sometimes advancing slowly, always maintaining calm. Signals passed silently. Only when every position was set did the pressure increase. Shouts, movement, and decoys triggered the herd's instinct to flee, but only in the direction chosen by the hunters. The animals thundered down prepared lanes toward the cliff. The fall, often 10 meters or more, killed most instantly. Those that survived were dispatched quickly below. The hunt itself was intense, but brief. The true challenge came afterward. Processing the harvest required speed, discipline, and cooperation. Fresh meat spoiled quickly. Thousands of pounds had to be transformed into stable food within days. Every person had a role. Meat was sliced thin to dry rapidly. Racks were erected to expose strips to wind and smoke. Fires smoldered continuously, driving off insects and slowing bacterial growth. Fat, the most valuable resource, was rendered carefully. Fat provided more than twice the calories of lean meat and was essential for surviving long winters. Rendered fat was poured over dried meat, sometimes mixed with berries or marrow, creating dense, high-energy food that could be stored for years when properly sealed. This preserved food, often known as pemmican, was not merely nourishment. It was insurance. Stored in rawhide bags, cached underground, or hung safely above moisture and scavengers, these reserves allowed communities to face winter without panic. When snow deepened and herds moved away, food remained. When illness or injury reduced hunting capacity, stored food filled the gap. Nothing was wasted. Bones were cracked for marrow or shaped into tools. Sinew became cordage. Hides became clothing and shelter. Up to 90% of each animal was used. Efficiency was not ideological. It was practical. Equally important was how food was distributed. Among many Plains nations, sharing was not optional. It was enforced by custom and expectation. A successful hunt fed the entire community. Elders, children, widows, and the injured were prioritized. Strong hunters ate last. Hoarding was discouraged not through moral lectures, but through social consequences. This system transformed individual risk into collective resilience. No single hunter's failure meant starvation. No household faced scarcity alone. Knowledge, too, was shared deliberately. Children learned tracking, weather reading, and processing skills from an early age. Redundancy was built into the culture. Multiple people knew how to perform every critical task. Anthropologists studying these societies later observed that famine mortality was significantly lower in communal indigenous systems than in nearby colonial settlements. The reason was not that resources were infinite, but that risk was distributed. Modern economists would recognize this as risk pooling. Indigenous communities practiced it long before the term existed. European societies, by contrast, often relied on private stockpiles, market access, or state intervention during crises. When these mechanisms failed, famine followed. Food insecurity was not neutralized. It was postponed. This difference became even more apparent during periods of disruption. War, trade collapse, or climate fluctuation devastated European populations repeatedly. Indigenous systems absorbed shocks more effectively because they were designed for variability. That design did not emerge by accident. It was refined over centuries through observation, adaptation, and transmission of knowledge. Oral histories preserved lessons about when to hunt, where to burn, how to process, and how to share. These stories were not folklore in the modern sense. They were operational manuals encoded in narrative form. However, these systems were not indestructible. In the 19th century, colonial expansion deliberately dismantled indigenous food security across North America. Controlled burning was outlawed and punished. Bison were slaughtered commercially at an industrial scale, collapsing the foundation of plain subsistence. Hunting grounds were restricted. Mobility was curtailed. Communities were forced onto reserves where traditional systems could no longer function. The result was not progress. It was famine. Where food security once prevailed, hunger became widespread. Dependency replaced autonomy. The same societies that had survived centuries of environmental variability were rendered vulnerable not by ecological failure, but by political force. This history matters because its lessons remain relevant. Today, food insecurity persists even in technologically advanced societies. Despite mechanized agriculture, global trade, and scientific knowledge, millions remain vulnerable to supply disruptions, economic inequality, and climate instability. Abundance exists, but access does not. Indigenous food systems demonstrate that security is not solely a matter of yield. It is a matter of design, coordination, preservation, sharing, ecological knowledge. Modern initiatives led by indigenous communities are restoring these principles. Controlled burns are returning to grasslands. Bison herds are being reintroduced to ancestral territories. Food sovereignty programs reconnect younger generations with traditional knowledge that survived in memory, even when practice was suppressed. These efforts are not about returning to the past. They're about recovering systems that worked. The contrast between Europe's centuries of famine and indigenous food security is not a moral parable. It is a technical one. It shows that societies starve not because food is absent, but because systems fail to distribute, preserve, and share it effectively. The plains hold this lesson in their soil, written in layers of bone and ash. They tell a story of human survival engineered through cooperation rather than competition, through foresight rather than reaction. The question facing modern societies is not whether these systems were effective. History answers that clearly. The question is whether their principles will be recognized and adapted before scarcity once again reveals the cost of ignoring them.